Then the next lesson using bias strips is using bias strips to make nice, narrow straight lines. It's easier to work with bias to make a straight line than it is to make a straight template and a straight piece of goods, because you end up with a better result. And I've marked a line on this side of the fabric, and I'm going to make a very, very narrow line. Placing my folded edge very close to that line and just sewing in a straight line 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of my bias. This too will obviously need trimming, but it's easier to work with a slightly wider piece and trim it than it is to work with a more narrow piece. The amount of waste you have is not significant enough to be an issue. Very, very narrow straight line. And as I said in the written part of this tutorial, this is how I made the heartstrings in the Baltimore album quilt, the center bottom block, and how I put the very narrow rim on the water bucket that the elephant stands beside in the Bird of Paradise quilt. You just get very, very narrow, 1/8 inch away from the folded edge. I probably could sew a little closer. It makes it a little bit harder to fold it back over. Fabric will only have that much forgiveness in it. It doesn't want to be folded if it's too narrow. But for here, there, and then make a knot to finish your seam, and then trim close to your stitching, once again without cutting your background fabric. You don't want to cut a hole in what you're making. And once again, blind stitch it down. You could do this, I mean, you could have a 1/8 inch curved vine as well. This could be a very, very narrow curved vine. The principle is the same. It just depends on how close you sew to that finished edge and how closely you trim your seam. And you can see I'm ending up with a very nice, very narrow, straight piece of bias applique. This is the very narrow straight piece that I showed you how to apply to your fabric. It hasn't been pressed or anything, which is why it is slightly lumpy, but this is how you would make a very narrow stem. If you wanted to vary the width of the stem, go from narrow to wider, then you would vary the width of your seam, and as you folded, that would then make a wider at the bottom, more narrow at the top. Ordinarily in applique, we cover the ends with a leaf or a flower, or they're tucked into a vase or something like that. If you needed to finish the end, you would, as you sewed the bias, the folded edge over, you would tuck under your end and sew it in a similar fashion to make a nice finished end. I didn't do that on these, but presumably you could do that, or cover it with a leaf, or cover it with a flower. And you end up with very smooth curves, finished sides on both sides, and useful technique for making very, very narrow straight lines as well as curved lines.